So we're going to get started. Hopefully everybody had the teas and coffees and everything. As I mentioned, the next two speakers will talk through a little bit more technology perspective. Sometimes those are simple basics. The first speaker is Drew Griffin. He's with Elsevier. He's the mobile guy at Elsevier. That's how they refer to him. But Elsevier is, invests a lot into research, trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. And Drew also involved a lot of those things in terms of from a technology perspective and everything. So I'll let Drew take it from here.
Should be learning more about Macs. Okay, thanks, Ravinder. Hi everyone. My name is Drew Griffin. I am the mobile program manager at Elsevier. So, just to give you guys the standard boilerplate Elsevier at a glance overview here. I guess for the purposes of this discussion, the only thing I really kind of want to take away from the slide is, you can arbitrarily bisect Elsevier into two basic parts, books and journals. And that's kind of at the high level, that's sort of how we split up our mobile app portfolio. When it comes to journals, you're typically looking at content that gets renewed in the app according to some kind of periodic schedule. And when we're talking about books, it's typically content that's more or less static, or at least remains static for a certain slightly longer period of time. So I'll skip quickly past this slide here. Is mobile here to stay? Probably all think that, otherwise you wouldn't be here in this room. I just think it's kind of funny. You can watch this whole mobile revolution pretty much every day on the news. I mean, I was watching CNBC the other day, and no one even wants to talk about Dell computers. You've got Mark Zuckerberg, who's promising to do something with Facebook Mobile after his IPO issues. You've got, Hewlett Packard laid off, over 20,000 people, I think it was last week. So the PC makers are in trouble. Mobile apps are on the rise. And just two quick points here. In 2011, the smartphone sales actually exceeded PC sales, and depending upon what report you look at and who you get your data from, it's expected that tablet sales will actually exceed PC sales in anywhere from 1 to 4 years. So I picked a reasonable number, 3. So if I had to sum up Elsevier's strategy in one slide, this would pretty much be it. According to a lot of our own internal data, US doctors like iOS over any other OS, which is pretty much Android at this point, by this astounding ratio, 15 to 1. And the US doctors prefer apps to web in a 5 to 2 ratio. So that pretty much defines our strategy here. When it comes to students and nurses, both nurse students and practicing nurses, the data is a little hard to come by, but it looks to us like they still have a very iOS-centric bent. And when I'm talking about, when I say US doctors prefer app to web, when I talk about web, what I mean is that same website you've all been visiting for 20 years now just shrunk down to a form factor that looks good on a smartphone. No one wants to see that, and I think some of the guys up here have already mentioned that before. They don't want to consume data that way. So given those things, it's native apps over mobile web. It's iOS right now over Android by a huge margin. And, I guess the easiest thing to do is if you want to see this strategy in action at Elsevier, you can just search for Elsevier in iTunes. You'll find we've got, it's 245 apps, but it's after 10 o'clock in the morning, so it's probably a little higher than that by now. If that gives you any idea of the rate with which we're doing mobile development. If you look in Google Play or the what used to be called the Android Marketplace, I think we've got like 30 apps out there. So It's a huge disparity. Both numbers are growing. We're kind of at the point where we've got a mature enough Apple app portfolio that we are starting to take some of those native iOS Objective-C apps and re-express them, rewrite them in Java so they can be running on the Android platform. But still, it's iOS. That's where it's at right now for us. So to put all of this in context a little bit, give a little bit more background on what I do. So, when you've got this portfolio of over 300 apps and growing every day, the way that Elsevier typically works is you've got the two business units. You've got books and you've got journals. And, before, say, the past year or so, everybody was kind of going out and doing their own thing. They were finding their own vendors. They were coming up with their own designs. They were trying to figure out their own back-end services. And that's fine, and that works well, to a certain degree. But at some point, you've got to come up with some central office, some central repository of information where you can share all the failings, because we've had probably more of them than successes over the past year, with the rest of the group. So my position here at Elsevier kind of gives me a bit of a unique perspective, because sooner or later, every mobile app that we develop comes through my team. Sometimes people will come to me because they want help looking for a vendor. Sometimes they'll want help with technical guidelines. Sometimes they'll want help picking a platform to target. That email is always easy to answer. Right now, iOS. Good with iOS. After you get a certain number of apps out there, you start to reach this tipping point where we don't have to create new back-end services now for every single app. We can start to share back-end services amongst multiple apps. So I can let the business units know, hey, you don't have to worry about handling things like user registration. Give an example of that. We've got a way that we can do it for you. Another big issue that we always come across, which we were all just talking about up here, is the infamous Apple App Store guidelines. Probably everybody here has been rejected at least once or twice. I would guess that I probably hold the record. And all I can say is I've got a couple slides on maybe how to avoid that. But, don't let it depress you. I've got a couple points on best practices and just some anecdotes, things that we've come across that don't really fit in any other category. So the first app I wanted to take a look at, and these aren't really case studies. These are more vehicles with which to sort of show you guys where we've had our successes and where we've had our failures, and maybe how you guys can learn from some of the things we've picked up over the last 2 years or so. The Netter Atlas of Human Anatomy is a book app. So in its physical manifestation, it's this massive 521-page, 25-pound book, standard anatomy textbook. Excuse me. And by the time we got to the point where we were ready to do a mobile app for Netter Atlas, we had already come to the decision that iOS is where we wanted to be. Because Netter Atlas is a full-fledged textbook, it really doesn't make any sense to attempt to use a smaller form factor. So we didn't even bother looking at smartphones. The Netter Atlas is a content embedded app. So what that means is a couple of things. So number one, when you download the app from iTunes, you get the entire thing. You get the entire massive 1.35 gigabyte download from the iTunes store. It can take hours to download. And actually, I think the maximum iOS app size you can have in iTunes is 2 gigs. So we're racing towards that. So because all the content's embedded, if you look at the network topology, it's pretty simple. There really aren't any backend services in the Netter app except for one, which I'll talk about in a second. It's a paid app. When we originally developed Netter Atlas, we trying to do a demo here at the end. So Netter is a paid app. So generally when we have paid apps, we don't include the advertisements in the app. And it's highly customizable by individual users. And so this is kind of, when you come to content on a form factor like the iPad, our big thing is leverage the platform, right? So we could easily have taken the Netter anatomy book, all 521 plates or images. Actually, the drawings by Frank Netter, who's an artist and a doctor. We could easily have taken all that content and put it into some kind of ebook format and just, have the users flip through some app on the iPad. That would be relatively trivial to do. But what we tried to do was leverage a platform. So we're trying to make this content kind of come alive, make sure it's interactive, make something different, something usable. So this is just the Netter splash screen. I don't know if you guys recognize this image. I'm told Frank Netter has a pretty cult following. I mean, I've been messing around with the Netter app on the train coming home from the office, and I had some guy looking over my shoulder going absolutely berserk. I mean, I've had that happen to me a couple of occasions, so I never know who's going to come out of the woodwork when I show this slide. Anyway, so after the splash screen loads, this is the first thing you see when you first load the app. So, as I said, this is iOS only. This is written in Objective-C. It's only on the iPad, only on the Apple platform. And one of the common complaints that I get, internal complaints I get, is that, when you put an app in the iTunes store, and let's forget about in-app purchases and subscriptions and journals and all that, when you put an app like this into the iTunes store, how do you get to know your users? Like, how do you know who they are? Because Apple is not going to be forthcoming with that information. One of the things you can do is, if you agree to give us your first name, last name, email address, country, what best describes you, if you do that, forget what it says, 40 additional plates. So if you do give us that information, you get 40 additional plates. And what we get in return is a little bit of information about the user. So that's kind of good. It's interesting because I remember when the app first went live, I was looking at the, you're timing me? I was looking at the data that was coming back from the user registration services just to make sure that the delineation was right, the formatting was right. And we always knew that this was going to be a problem. You can ask this data from users. According to the Apple guidelines, you cannot make it mandatory, so this is purely an optional screen. So if you look at the top right, you see the skip button, which we purposely made blue so it would stand out so it can be skipped. The problem is the data is pretty much, it's very difficult to validate. Actually, it's unvalidatable. You could say it's dirty. And I mean that literally because when I was looking through some of the original registration data, the first name, the last name, email address, they're all free text fields. So you can type in anything you want there. It looks like most of it's pretty decent data, but there's expletives all over the place. So, I guess you get what you pay for. So, you're giving away 40 plates and you're getting potentially crappy data. But this is one way that you can get some information from users. Apple had no problem with it as long as it's optional. And, one of the things that my group has provided is, number one, we've got the Objective-C code that any other internal group in Elsevier can use to throw up this screen. And it's modifiable, so, they can add different fields if they want. And also, we've got the backend service created to capture all this data, massage it into internal formats and put it into our backend database. So that's the user registration screen. So this is a typical cutaway of what the Netter app looks like inside. So there's 521 or so of these plates, 5 plus 40 if you agree to register. And so when we talk about being highly customizable, there's a couple things going on here. So each of these labels can be tapped. And when a label is tapped, we call that highlighting. Those are the ones that are kind of in green. So these pins can be turned on and off. These labels can be turned on and off in addition to being highlighted. And the lines that connect the pins to the labels can also be turned on and off. You can make notes, multiple notes on any plate using that button. And you can also use, I don't know if you can see that or not, but that's a quizzing feature. So If you click that button, you'll be given a choice of 10, 20, or 30, 10, 20, or 30 question quiz based on the number of labels that are in the that are displayed on the plate. And then, so the quiz displays a label, and then you have to touch on the point that corresponds to where the pin would be. So, and there's also bookmarking. So it's highly customizable. And one of the other things that we did with the Netter app, which we're also pretty much rolling out for every single one of our apps, and we'll talk about this more a little bit later, is mobile analytics, right? So there's a whole bunch of packages out there you can use for analytics. And when I say analytics, I'm talking about typically what we use is the Google Analytics package or the Flurry Analytics package. And what an analytics package basically does is you can embed tags in various parts of the Objective-C software, and you can get reports on exactly when users are using what function, how often they're using that function, what they're doing in that function. The nice thing about Google Analytics, and Flurry actually works this way too, is you can get offline analytics. So one of the other key requirements for pretty much every one of our apps is you've got to have some content available offline. You have to assume that there isn't always internet connectivity. So the analytics packages will still capture all that user data, but the next time the user goes online, all that analytics information is sent to either a Google Analytics account, Google's nice dashboard you can log into and view your analytics and pie charts and all that cool stuff. And Flurry basically has the same thing. So what the analytics package has showed us that there's two things that, and based on the registration data, I'll just say students love because it seems to be who's buying the app the most. The two things that they love are the ability to highlight, because I guess they'll go into class and the professor will say, all right, you're going to be testing on these 18 labels, but there's 100 labels on the plate, so they can just highlight the 18 that they want to see. And quizzing is huge. So the analytics are nice because those are the kind of things that help us drive our next set of requirements. And we kind of work like a lot of development shops for a lot of these apps. Once 1.0 gets released, the development team, for the past month or so, while 1.0 has been waiting for approval for Apple, has already started working on 1.x or 2.0, whatever we're calling it. So we can look at the analytics package and we can say, all right, we know that users love quizzing. What might be something else we can do along the quizzing route that can become requirements for 1.x? So analytics is a great thing. Just another quick overview of another type of app we have is journal apps. So again, iOS only, iPad only, because that's a form factor that makes the most sense for reading journals. And one of the things, actually, we just did this a couple of weeks ago. We got our first app approved by Apple into Newsstand. So Newsstand is a really interesting and really cool thing because it's the one place where Apple has kind of broken their rules. I mentioned in the Netter app, there really isn't any way to get any user information other than popping up that registration screen, and we just get what they give us, or we get nothing if the user decides to skip it. But with Newsstand, one of the things, if you want to put your app into Newsstand, you can basically write a normal app. So we had a series of apps that we wrote. We did not put them in Newsstand because when we started writing these apps, Newsstand wasn't around yet. This is pre-iOS 5. So our idea was we're going to create a whole bunch of apps that we can essentially templatize. So we'll create the first app, and then we'll construct that app and its back-end services in such a way that we can take the template and we can pull the content from different sources depending upon what kind of journal we wanted that app to be. So if we want it to be journal A, a couple tweaks to the template gets compiled, it gets sent to Apple, and now we've got journal A sitting on your iPad desktop, Springboard it's called. And so we did that. And then we took that same template, we made some very minor modifications to the front end and to the back end, submitted that to Apple, that got submitted. We were able to do that 6 more times before we finally got shot down by Apple for spamming the App Store. And what spamming the App Store means is Apple doesn't like a templatized approach where you've got multiple apps that all have the same feature function set, and only the content differs. So, that was months going back and forth with them arguing our case. And then at that point, iOS 5 came out, Newsstand came out, and Newsstand follows a very different paradigm. Because Apple's got this thing. They've got this UI design philosophy where they like it when things in the virtual world have a direct analog to their physical counterparts, right? I mean, even if you look at the Newsstand, let me have a shot here. Even look at the Newsstand, the bookshelf. I mean, it's got wood grain. If you look at the Apple, the calendar on your iPad or your iPhone, you can see it's leather on the perimeter, and you can see the stitching. They love that paradigm, and they carried that paradigm home through Newsstand. Because although they don't explicitly come out and say this, they expect every app that sits in Newsstand to mirror a physical journal. And so, just like a journal, you open up, you read it, every couple of articles you expect to see an advertisement. In this case, in Newsstand, our templated approach worked. So they're okay with that. They're okay with us putting however many journal apps we want to put into Newsstand. They're okay with all those apps having pretty much the same look and feel, the same feature function set, which is basically this. This is sort of a hodgepodge of multiple things going on, but they're okay with a whole bunch of journals looking like this. Journal A, Journal B, Journal C, all having the same look and feel. This is the templated approach. Because this kind of fits that whole UI paradigm. You expect magazines to all function the same way. They're okay with this. Let's skip to the slides here. But the trick is, and we've talked about this, I think, earlier today, is, how do you create that sense of stickiness? Okay, so now you've got an app. How do you create a loyal user? First of all, what is even a loyal user? You're probably looking at someone, and we look at it as someone who consistently uses your app 3 or 4 times a month. That's a pretty loyal user, especially when you look at like Facebook users who are on 20 times a day. So how do you create that stickiness? The nice thing about Newsstand is that you've got your app sitting in Newsstand, and the way it would work before is when you tapped on that app, if that app is just sitting on your iPad Springboard, you tapped on the app would open up. At that point, the app would go out and say, hey, are there any new issues for me to download? And there was a couple seconds while that check went on, and then there's 30 seconds or a minute or 5 minutes if there was an issue to be downloaded, depending on how big the issue was. The nice thing about Newsstand is this content is delivered. I have the word remotely there, but everything you say is the content's delivered in the background. So when there's a new issue ready, the back-end services that we have, and this is standard, pretty much every Newsstand app is going to work this way. The back-end services that we have, and I'm grossly oversimplifying this too, and I can go into the tedious details if anyone wants to hear it, but basically, the back-end services notify the app and say, hey, you need to wake up, no matter what you're doing, even if you're not open, even if the iPad is asleep and essentially turned off, even if the user's, in another app answering mail or whatever, you can wake up, you can connect to your back-end servers, and you can download this latest issue. So now when the user goes back into their journal that's sitting, or their periodical that's sitting in Newsstand, the content is already there. So they don't have to wait at all. I mean, we talked earlier about, users don't want to wait 6 seconds and 10 seconds will never come back. Probably with these kind of apps, maybe you've got a little more leeway, but it is kind of cool that the app can download its content in the background. But that's not the coolest part. The coolest part is the Newsstand icon itself will update. So you'll get, and you probably have seen this yourselves if you've got a Newsstand, but if there's a new issue available, you'll get this little sash across here, right in the upper right-hand corner that says new. And also you'll get a little red circle here with the number of issues that you haven't read yet. So there's the stickiness, right? Because you've got to figure out some way, how do you get users to keep coming back into your app? Now, that's important because, if you've got the model where you need where you're being driven by advertising revenues. Well, how do you charge for your advertising slots, right? You need to have the analytics so you can say, hey, here's what people are doing in the app. So you need to have some way to constantly get the users to go back into the app. And the reality is, after a couple of months, I mean, I've seen some of these newsstand icons or some of these newsstands where there's hundreds and hundreds of journals in there. So how would you even know? So that's the stickiness. I mean, that kind of keeps, because no one can resist a notification that isn't acted upon. It's human nature. You log into Facebook and you see that one message, you have to read it. You're on vacation and you get an email on your BlackBerry, you have to read it. You get a notification from Newsstand that there's some new content out there and you want to read it. The other interesting thing about Newsstand is, and I'm finally getting back around to my point, is how do you get to know a little bit more about who your users really are, is you have to offer a subscription to your journal or your periodical or your magazine or your newspaper. It can be a free subscription, but it has to be a subscription. And it's a type of in-app purchase that's called an auto-renewable subscription. So what that means is the user says, yes, I want to buy 1 year of your journal for $60. If they click on that button, there will be a notification that comes up from Apple that says, are you willing to share certain information with the developer of this app? Now, the users are free to say no. And I think it even tells them what Apple is going to share with the developer. So if the user clicks yes, you can potentially get, the first name, the last name, the email address, and the postal code, I think it is, which at some point was probably one of Apple's concessions to publishers, but hey, we'll take it. So basically, if the user says yes, all that information is sort of sent to Apple's back end, and then you can log into the iTunes Connect portal, which if you're a developer and you're submitting your own apps, you will get access to this portal where you can download these so-called opt-in reports, and you can get all this information about these users. Yeah, the user can click no, but the benefit of this is if a user clicks yes, you can pretty much be assured that you're getting good data. This isn't free text fields like in the Netter app where you can type in any 4-letter word you want. I mean, you're getting the actual username, and, first name, last name, email address, and postal code that the users have signed up for their iTunes account with. So it's connected to a credit card. The problem with Newsstand is you have to offer one of these subscriptions. You have to offer either a free subscription, you have to offer an auto-renewable subscription. I think it can be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year. There's no way to get around that. And if you want to make your app open access, there really isn't any way to easily do that. We've tried creating our own model, which we got rejected for. We wanted to keep every issue, every article open access until at some point in the future we were going to decide, okay, now you're only going to be able to either buy an annual subscription, or if you're already a member of the society in this case, the Jack Society, you can log in with your credentials. So yes, so don't do that. Don't try and roll your own when it comes to iOS apps. Apple kind of shot us down. They said, no, you need to use our free model. The problem with that is when a user signs up for a free subscription, that free subscription will be automatically rolled into an annual subscription unless they cancel the free subscription, and you can make the free subscription for various durations, unless they cancel it. Our thinking was, and this is just the way most people are. No one wants to order something knowing that they can get their money back if they cancel it. No one wants to have to have the burden of trying to remember to cancel something. So we were thinking if we could roll our own, there would be no free trial. It would just be open access until it was no longer open access. But you have to offer the free trial. So users are just going to have to remember that before 24 hours before their free trial expires, whatever that is, 3 months, 6 months, they're going to have to cancel if they don't want the subscription. So we were afraid that would kind of slow uptake of the journal. No idea whether it will or not. Like I said, the first Newsstand journal just went live a couple of weeks ago, so we don't really have much at all in terms of any data on it. Yeah, you stand home. So this is a typical screenshot of what's going on if you're looking at one of the single issues. So just a couple things I'll highlight in here. There's advertisements, the ability to bookmark, the ability to take notes, small text, larger text. You can search. This will search content in the article. This will also search online content if you are logged into the app. In other words, if you're a subscriber. You can email, view the PDF, Facebook and Twitter, standard social layer integration. So, what's all that mean? What have we learned from our trials and tribulations with, I don't mean to pick on Netter and Jax, but between those two apps, we seem to have managed to violate pretty much every Apple guideline. So they were obvious ones to pick. So, a lot of people have different ideas about the whole concept of iteration. Ours is you can't do the rotisserie chicken thing. You can't set it and forget it. You've got to keep iterating. You've got to keep putting out new versions of the app. You've got to get some way for users to constantly engage with the app. You need to pay attention to what the users are saying to you. You need to come up with new feature functionality. So iterate. So one of the things we do is in almost all of our mobile projects, we never just plan for a single release. There's always going to be another feature release after 1.0. And that's even assuming that we don't have to do any hotfix releases, maintenance releases, bug fixes. So iterate and plan to iterate. You can't set it and forget it. Analytics, like I said, we use Google and Flurry, but there's multiple packages out there. Those two seem to work pretty well. On the marketing side, get an objective reviewer, and it's kind of interesting. So Netter went live in September of 2011, and we had 3 days in the 9 months or so since it's been live. We've had our highest number of downloads. So the first one was December 25th. So, kind of get that, what's going on. Everyone's unwrapping new iPads for Christmas and they want to fill them up. The second highest download date was the 26th of December, so everyone's cashing in iTunes gift cards. And then the third highest download date, and actually the total number of downloads for all these 3 dates is coincidentally the same, so these are all very, very high numbers, was March 25th. And I'm looking through the data and I'm like, well, that's kind of an odd date. I don't know how to correlate that, but as it turns out, that was the date that a positive review for the Netter app came out in, I think it was imedicaldevices.com. So it can make a huge impact if you can take an app that's live and get it into the hands of an objective reviewer. That may have done more to help our marketing efforts than almost anything else we've done. I know we've talked about this before, providing a feedback loop for users. Give them some way to contact you. Maybe you can preclude a really crappy review in the iTunes store. The other thing is we've gotten a lot of good ideas for future requirements from users who have no compunction about emailing us back. So that's incredibly helpful. Subscribe to metric sites. I think that's been brought up before. We use pretty much all this information is available from Apple if you want to go through the data, but it's kind of a pain. So there's a couple sites that we use. App Figures is one. App Annie is another, Distimo is another one. It just provides really well done documentation and graphs and pie charts on downloads, download rates, who's downloading what. When I say who, I mean what country is downloading what. Net profits after Apple takes their 30%. This is not just iOS centric. It will also report on your apps that are on Google Play. So metric sites are nice. Another thing is, and people go back and forth about this, but our advice right now is, like I said, I'm in a position where once in a while someone will come to me and say, hey, what's the deal? Can you help us get this mobile app off the ground? We want to do a free and paid version. We're shying away from that for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's just a pain, because if you do a free version and you do a paid version, at the end of the day what you've got is you've got two separate apps. So you've got two separate lines of code to maintain. And because they both represent the same version, there's probably a significant amount of code in those two apps that is in common, which means if there's a bug in one, there's probably a bug in two. So that's 2 hot fixes that have to be done, 2 more submissions to Apple, and once your portfolio starts to grow and you get enough of these issues, that becomes a serious, serious problem. Because like I said before, you got your development team working on version 1.0. As soon as that goes to Apple for review, that team's already working on 2.0. So when these defects come in from users, who's going to work on them? It's the developers that are currently working on your next release. So then it screws up the development schedule. So we tend to not do free and paid versions. And even if it wasn't laziness, there is another good reason not to do free and paid versions, is because you have to be really careful, because you cannot submit a free version to the iTunes store and use that free version to promote the paid version. You also can't do anything in the free version that makes it look or smell or feel like it's a demo app or a trial app or a sample. You need to avoid those words in the app name, in the description, in any sort of information you're giving to the users or Apple about the app. So because of that, it's just easier not to do it. Like I said, we did that actually with the Netter iPad app, and with the free version, the full version is 521 plates. The free version was, I think, 40 plates. So we left all the buttons in the free version on the screen, but we grayed them out if it didn't make sense to have them enabled because there was so little content in the free version. That smacked like a demo or trial app to Apple, so they said you can't do that. So fair enough. We learned our lesson, so we tend not to do free and paid versions anymore. And just one other thing before I leave this slide is, the other thing you want to avoid is you can't do pin codes, you can't do activation codes. Don't use the word pin, don't use the word activation, don't use the word code. It's okay to ask users to log into your app for whatever reason, whether it's to unlock content already in the app or whether it's to download content coming from some back-end service. You can't ask for a pin code. We've had apps that have been live since before the PIN code law came out, and we had to resubmit, and it's a pain. Let's see. Am I in trouble? I'll keep going. All right, a couple more minutes. Another point that I'll just reiterate is apps are just like real software. So, it's great to do your quality assurance testing, and I've got a whole diatribe about that. But the reality is there's going to be bugs. It's software, it's part art, so things are going to fail. Maintenance agreements are important. You got to figure out who's going to do what, have your defect tracking system, have your maintenance engineers ready to go, source code repositories, all that stuff. Customer support, these guys, they need to know how the app works, so you not only have to factor in time to train them, to get them used to how the app works, but every time you do another iteration and there's more functionality added to the app, these guys have to be in the loop. Because nothing makes customer support angrier than when they get an email or a phone call about an app that they know nothing about. Not that that has ever happened to me, but I think that they would probably get angry. And they would probably email your manager, and it would be this whole thing. That's just conjecture. Quality assurance testing. I know that we've harped on this before, and with 300 apps out there that Elsevier has between iTunes and Android, you would think that you would be worried about overwhelming your maintenance team with hot fixes. But the thing is, it gets worse because it's not really 300 apps. It's probably actually 400 or 500 or 600 or maybe even 700, because some users are fanatic about upgrading when a new version of the app comes out. A lot of users aren't, and you could probably do a psychological doctoral thesis on figuring out what kind of people are insanely on it about upgrading their apps and what kind of people aren't. So if you've got version 1 out, and then you come out with an upgrade for version 2, you've got 2 versions out there. You've got some non-zero set of people who are still on version 1, and then another group of people who are still on version 2. Now you come out with version 3, and you've got the same thing. So that's not one app, that's 3 apps. And it gets worse because if you've made any database changes, so basically, there's a little SQLite database that's basically embedded in every app. If you've made any database changes between, say, version 1 and version 2 to accommodate some new piece of functionality that you're keeping track of, now you've got to worry about quality assurance testing the upgrade path. You can't just test version 3.0 that you're ready to submit. Now you got to worry about, well, if I'm on version 1.0 and I go right to this latest version 3.0, how's that going to work? Are there any bugs there? What if I'm a user on 2.0 and I go up to 3.0? Any bugs there? So it becomes a huge deal. So I won't say it's luck, but I think there's one big reason why we, so far, have not had this maintenance nightmare. It's because we've got this three-pronged approach to quality assurance testing. And none of this is really new to mobile apps, but this is standard software development. So you've got your white box testing, right? That's the testing that the individual developers do, like Kiwi Tech, before they turn the code of the app over to Elsevier. These are the guys who knows the code, so they're testing for one set of conditions. Once the app comes over to Elsevier, it depends on the complexity of the app and the size of the project team, a couple of other factors, but if it's a small enough app and a small enough project team will typically do the quality assurance testing themselves, which is cool. If it's a slightly more complicated app, then we can employ the use of professional trained quality assurance testers. So that's the second prong of attack. That's the black box testing. And then the third level of testing we do is, I call it like the 11-year-old girl testing, because I just watch how my daughter downloads apps from iTunes stores, and there's no reading of documentation. You download this thing, she has no idea what it does. The icon just looks cool, and she's like clicking and pinching and zooming and dragging, messing around with the app, not really knowing what she's doing. That's exploratory testing or ad hoc testing, probably more politically correct term. So one of the things we have at Elsevier is nobody, but in general, nobody submits apps to any app store themselves, whether it's iOS or Android or even BlackBerry. We do have a couple of BlackBerry apps out there. They get submitted to a central release team. It's the release team that packages up all this metadata, the keywords, the description of the app, and actually handles the uploading it to Apple. And the last thing that the release team does before they actually upload the binary to Android or Apple is they'll do this sanity test. And so that's kind of our third prong. And you would be surprised, we've pre-rejected some of our own apps saying, look, we can't submit this to Apple. We can't submit it because there's a performance bottleneck here. We can't submit it because we noticed that there's a crash, so we can't submit it. And also when the release team does their quality assurance testing, they've got their iPad and the app in one hand, and they've got the iTunes App Store review guidelines in the other hand, and they're looking for those things that we've been caught on in the past. So, in that sense, we pre-reject our own apps. So that seems to be working. We don't have this huge maintenance nightmare. I mean, there's issues, and we've had hot fixes, but for the number of instances of apps that are out there, we've actually done pretty good. Migration paths need to be tested for any app that allows users to customize. I kind of touched upon that. Sorry, Griffin. Again, Apple, there's 3 documents that you absolutely need to know. Give them to your developers, give them to the project managers, team leaders, whatever. There's the App Store Review Guidelines, the iTunes Connect Developers Guide, and the Apple Human Interface Guidelines. They're all available to you once you sign up for your Apple developers account. They're key. And then the other thing is, like we mentioned before, is these things change over time. The documents themselves indicate that they're living documents, so you do have to pay attention to any changes that Apple comes up with. But again, Apple-specific concerns. I don't know if this is new to anyone or if Griffin just wants me to shut up or what. No? All right, I'll keep going. So, no in-app links to commerce. We were talking about this earlier today. You can't have any link embedded anywhere in your app that sends the user to a website where they could type in their credit card. Because, again, as we mentioned before, that pretty much cuts Apple out of the loop. Apple will usually find those links and they will reject the app. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is Apple doesn't find the links right away, and they approve the app. So the app is live, and you've got users downloading it. And then somehow Apple finds those links, and they'll send you an email or a phone call and say, you need to fix this or your app is gone. That's a really crappy phone call to get. So, and I don't go through your links. Just leave it at that. And it's not the case that you can just, battery power. Even my MacBook is telling me I'm talking too long. You have to kind of follow the bouncing links too, because if the link goes to your main website, and from that website, a user can get to some ancillary page where they can buy something. Even if it's something that's completely unrelated to the app. Even if you've got a journal with a link to buy horseshoes, that will fail. So follow your links. Apps can be rejected based solely on the UI because it doesn't conform to the human interface guidelines. So read that document that I mentioned in the previous slide. Avoid the software template approach. So basically, anytime you think, man, this is going to be great, I can crank out these apps left and right. As soon as you start getting that positive energy, you need to take a step back and think, wait a minute, this is going to be too easy. Something must be wrong. The exception is newsstand. That approach is cool there. Universal binaries. Unless the iPad and the iPhone version are significantly different apps, you can submit one binary that will take advantage of the screen real estate on both. A lot of our apps aren't because we have completely different versions for the iPhone and the iPad, and we take advantage of the real estate. No demo or trial apps, which I talked about, pen and activation codes. Apple will reject based on what they call trivial apps, apps that are just link aggregators, apps that don't offer any useful use will be rejected. I don't know how you define some of those things. I think some of these things we were going to talk about as a panel later, but I can just kind of keep going. So we've thrown around a couple of terms like a mobile website. So, and you guys can just shut me up if you know all this, but sometimes it helps just to get some definitions out there. So a mobile optimized website, like I said before, is just the same old website you've been using for years, CNN.com, just re-expressed in a form factor that looks better on a smartphone, for example. So you're not constantly scrolling up and down and left and right just to see the entire web page. That's a mobile optimized website. There's this thing out there called HTML5 that everybody seems to have a different definition about. What HTML5 is, if you want to be a purist, is just this massive document that describes the HTML markup language. And what it says is, if a browser encounters a web page, this is how the browser should react. This is how it should display the text. This is how it should display a combo box. This is how it should display whatever. This is how the font should be handled. This is how color should be handled. That's HTML5. It's just the latest and greatest version of HTML, which is the authoring language, the hypertext markup language that pretty much powers every website that you've been using for a while. So when people talk about HTML5 apps, I don't think what they really mean is just another plain old website that uses the HTML5 spec. What they're really talking about is this thing called a web app. And a web app is a combination of HTML5 plus a couple of other technologies like Canvas and JavaScript and CSS. The cool thing about HTML5 is if it's done right, it can mimic a native app, which means it can do things that a normal website could not possibly do. It also can't do some things that native apps are really good at. So you can build an HTML5 app. Users can get to that app from your website. There's nothing that has to be submitted to Apple. There's no 30% cut to the iTunes Store or Google Play for that matter. So that's great. Of course, now you're back in the same boat you were years ago. How do you drive traffic to your new HTML5 web app? We've got a couple of skunk work projects going on at Elsevier, experimenting with HTML5 apps. But for us, there's two big showstoppers here. One thing is if you've got a native app, You've got offline storage. So you take the example of the Netter app. There's 2 gig. There's 2 gig of storage that I can use in my Netter app to store all this offline content. Offline storage for HTML5 is going to be an issue. I think the offline storage is limited to, I see different numbers. I think it's 10 meg. Actually, 10 meg split up over 2 different caches, but that almost doesn't matter. But 10 meg is way too small. I mean, we've got single articles sometimes that are larger than 10 meg. And if you're talking about an app that's got embedded video, even a couple of pictures, you can hit 10 meg easily. So that's a problem. HTML5 is a spec that has not been officially ratified yet. So maybe they'll get with the ball, or they'll get with the program, and they'll increase that offline storage. But we're not counting on that. So that's one big problem. The other problem is if you have a native app, you can do push notifications. So the app can receive messages even when it's not running in the foreground. So you can push information to the user. At this point, there really isn't a good way to do push notifications in HTML5 apps. A couple other things that HTML5 web apps won't let you do. These things aren't really a huge deal right now for us. You can't get access to the camera. Well, basically, you can't get access to the camera. There is a version of Android that allows it. An HTML5 web app, not just a plain old HTML5 website. An HTML5 web app can't get access to GPS data. Can't get access to the accelerometer. No alerts and notifications, no push notifications. Inferior UIs to native apps. I mean, does a native app look like a native app? It depends on how much work you want to put into it. You know, if you really want to invest heavily in HTML5 and you've got some really good developers, I think you could probably get an HTML5 web app to look just like a native app. Some obvious examples are the Financial Times app and the Playboy app too. Those 2 apps actually have a pretty good user interface. There's like a joke in there somewhere. Inferior performance in native apps. Yeah, you know, the current kind of school of thought seems to be that if you're running natively, that you're running faster. The reality is, again, if you're willing to put the time and the effort into HTML5, you could probably get an app that outperforms native in some cases, but again, this is one of the reasons why I'm not up here saying HTML5 web apps, that's the way to go. It's just not there yet. And not that anyone is in a vindictive mood here, but Apple actually is a big HTML5 supporter. So I read these blogs where people will say, yeah, I'm going to totally screw over Apple. I'm going to make an HTML5 web app and cut them out of their 30%. Apple doesn't care. Apple's a huge HTML5 supporter. How could they not be? Because at the end of the day, what Apple wants to do, and what Google wants to do, is they want to sell hardware. I'm convinced that even if Google Play and even if the iTunes Store didn't make a dime, they wouldn't discontinue it because the point is to sell hardware. So HTML5, Apple would be insane not to fully support HTML5 in Safari, and they do, and it works really well. I don't know if you know the history of the Financial Times app, but they were in the iTunes Store. They had a spat with Apple. They didn't want to pay Apple their 30%. So they decided, well, we're going to pull our app from the iTunes Store. We're going to create an HTML5 web app. We're going to keep all our money for ourselves. And that's fine, and they kind of made it seem like, well, you know, we're really getting back at Apple for this, but they're not, because HTML5 is not this write once, run anywhere thing. We saw it with Java years ago. I mean, you can probably even remember, you maybe even see it now, HTML regular websites that say best viewed in Internet Explorer. These HTML5 websites, these HTML5 web apps, are going to be the same thing. You're not going to be able to write an HTML5 web app and think that it's going to be supported and look great on every browser. It's only going to look good on one browser, and that's the browser that you... So my presentation's over because my battery's dead. So there we go. But anyway, just to finish that thought, HTML5 is a spec, right? So every browser developer out there is going to interpret that spec differently, which means when you write your web app for Safari, you're going to have to optimize it for Safari. And if you want it to run well on Internet Explorer, you're going to have to optimize it for Internet Explorer too. So essentially, I think you've got multiple lines of code to support this web app.
I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying we're looking into it. It's got a little ways to go. think that was it.
Any questions?
What we're going to do is hold the questions and let last presenter go, and then we're going to have a Q&A session anyway. So you can start with Drew at that time. Thanks, Drew.